Cool. Well, my name's Hilary Eisen, and I'm the Policy Director at Winter Wildlands Alliance. I'm very excited to be here tonight. This is my first time in this area. As she mentioned, I'm from Bozeman, Montana, and I just haven't had the opportunity to come to Colorado that often. So it's really beautiful here, and I'm really excited to finally see this place that I've heard a lot about and talked to a lot of people about. So Winter Wildlands Alliance is the organization that I work for. We are a national nonprofit based in Boise, Idaho, that came together or was founded in 2000 when three local groups, one of which was in Colorado, that all worked with backcountry skiers on public lands issues in their sort of local area, realized that they would be more effective if they worked together at a national level. And so they came together and formed Winter Wildlands Alliance in 2000. And we represent human-powered winter recreation participants, which I like to just say backcountry skiers, but that includes Nordic skiers and snowshoers and ice climbers and you name it. And we work to preserve backcountry skiers' refuge on public lands. And our mission is that we're dedicated to promoting and preserving winter wildlands and quality human-powered snow sports experiences on public lands through education, outreach, and advocacy. And that's a pretty clunky, there's a lot to that. But basically, we have three programs. So we have the policy and advocacy program, which is what I do. We have our snow school program, which is a curriculum that we have designed that is all about snow science and outdoor education and just getting kids outside in the wintertime to introduce them to the fact that it's fun to go outside in the winter. And we work with schools and other educational programs across the country, getting kids out on snowshoes. I think we got like 60,000 kids or something last year out on snowshoes, many of which for the very first time, and taught them about how to dig a pit and what snow water equivalency is and how to track animals or identify like a bunny track versus a deer track. And it's a field-based curriculum. We also have the Backcountry Film Festival, which travels all over the country, and it's basically exactly what it sounds like. It's a film festival about backcountry skiing and other backcountry snow sports. And we use that as a way to inspire people to get outside and recreate on public lands. And lots of organizations use it as a fundraising tool. And so we provide it at a very low cost to our partner organizations. And then they host the film festival and bring in people and gather the community. And then, as I mentioned, the policy department, and we are working at the intersection of public lands and snow. And a big piece of that is winter travel planning through the 2015 over snow vehicle rule. However, being a national organization with all of two policy staff, one of which is me, we don't know every single thing there is to know about every single place that has snow in public lands. And so we work really closely with a network of grassroots groups and local partners all across the snow belt, so those places that get snow, including here in Gunnison, or more specifically up in Crested Butte. And we really rely on those local partners for their on-the-ground knowledge, and then we provide sort of policy expertise and help them navigate these processes. So getting into the over snow vehicle rule and where exactly it came from. So travel management planning is not a new concept. As was mentioned earlier, back in the 60s and before, off-road vehicle use really began to grow across the country, and that includes all sorts of different vehicles, from Jeeps to ATVs to snowmobiles, you name it. Like, we as a sort of population discovered that it was really fun to play with machines on outside, and it still is today. But back in the 60s, there wasn't really any regulation around how to do that and how to do that in a way that was respectful of the environment and other uses, and just sort of how to manage that. And people started getting really concerned about what those impacts might be to off-road vehicle use. And so in 1972, let me get my dates right here, President Nixon issued an executive order that addressed the use of off-road vehicles on public lands. And that was followed up in 1977 with an additional minor change to that by President Carter. But these executive orders are sort of the foundation of travel planning, both winter and summer, on all public lands. And they require federal land management agencies to plan for off-road vehicle use, to protect resources and other recreational uses. So to find a way to balance all these different activities. And there's just a couple quotes up here from folks that were working in policy in DC at the time, and some of the concerns that were being expressed and where this sort of came from. And so Senator Bible, in a hearing before the Senate Subcommittee on Parks and Recreation back in 1971, said, the off-road vehicle has opened up regions which were previously seldom traversed or seen by man. These once remote scenic wonders are now only as isolated as the capacity of the gas tank and man's desire to get there. And then Harrison Lush, who was the Assistant Secretary of the Interior, around that same time, actually in that same hearing, said, development and production of these vehicles has moved faster than our regulatory and legislative machinery. Their use is basically unregulated, and intensive use in limited areas or in fragile sites leaves devastating scars. Heavy indiscriminate use may have substantial irreversible effects. And so that's sort of the context in which these executive orders came from back way before I was born. So as I mentioned, in 1972, President Nixon issued the first of these executive orders. It's known as Executive Order 11644, which you don't need to remember, but it basically addresses the use of off-road vehicles on the public lands. And it says, in short, that when a land management agency, which is not just the Forest Service, but the Forest Service, the Park Service, the BLM, and the Fish and Wildlife Service, those are sort of the four major agencies that oversee our public lands, that they need to designate trails and areas for off-road vehicle use. And in doing so, they have to locate them to meet what is sort of referred to now as the minimization criteria. And so the minimization criteria say that these designations have to be done in a way that minimizes damage to soils, watersheds, vegetation, and other resources, minimizes harassment of wildlife and significant disruption of wildlife habitat, and minimizes conflict between off-road vehicle use and other recreational uses within that same area or on the public lands. And so that was back in 1972, which was a long time ago, but travel management planning seems like maybe it's a little bit more recent than that. That's because for the next sort of 3 decades, the different land management agencies tried to address this executive order in a number of different ways. And the Forest Service it was before 2005, but culminating in 2005, realized that they needed a regulation that would sort of standardize how they addressed this executive order, how they complied with the executive order, and how they designated routes and areas for off-road vehicle use. And this was during the Bush administration, and they sort of looked at it and said, one of the top 10 threats facing our public lands today, back then, was unmanaged off-road vehicle use and just recreational use in general. So they developed this travel management rule, and when the federal government develops a new regulation, it's a pretty big process that includes lots of public comment, and it's open to the entire country. And it was again before my time, so I cannot speak personally to what it was like to participate in that process, but I imagine some people in this room did. But at the end of the day, in 2005, the Forest Service published what's known as the Travel Management Rule, which required every national forest and national grassland in the country to establish a system of areas and trails where off-road vehicles are allowed to travel based on the minimization criteria, which I mentioned on the last slide. And this travel management rule has 3 parts. So subpart A is the part that you don't hear too much about, and that is the travel analysis process. So this is the Forest Service going and looking at their existing motorized network of roads and trails and kind of deciding, like, what do we really need, what do we not need, what's our footprint and how to manage that. And then there's subpart B, which most forests have already done, starting back in 2005, and that's sort of the summer travel management process. And so that's the process of designating routes and areas for wheeled vehicles. And that culminates in what's known as the motor vehicle use map, which is the really not helpful map that I'm sure many of you are familiar with, that's black and white, and you probably can't use it for navigational purposes because it doesn't have like any topography on it. But it does show you which routes and areas are open to wheeled vehicle use, and if a route or an area is not on that map, then it's not open to legal use. And so that subpart B process was completed across, it's already done on like 84% of the national forests in the country, and it was something the Forest Service really prioritized back when this rule was put in place. And then subpart C is the oversnow vehicle piece of travel management planning. Same deal, designate routes and areas for off-road vehicle use, in this case over snow use, in a way that meets the minimization criteria. However, when this travel management rule was written in 2005, the Forest Service said that subpart C was up to the forest supervisor's discretion as to whether or not they felt that their forest needed to engage in that process. And so there wasn't, subpart B was mandatory, everybody had to do it. Subpart C was up to each forest's individual discretion. And so that was something that Winter Wildlands and other groups were quite concerned about. This Executive Order 11644 listed the different off-road vehicles that it was talking about, and that, defined them, and that included vehicles that traveled over snow and ice. Over snow vehicles, we looked at that, our organization, other organizations looked at the Executive Order and said, this clearly says that you need to do this designation process for over snow vehicles as well as all the other types of off-road vehicles. And so during that rulemaking process that led up to the 2005 rule, we were participating in that. Many other organizations across the country, not just Winter Wildlands, were submitting comments and reaching out to the Forest Service and saying, hey, make sure that over snow vehicle use is included in your travel management rule. And they put out a draft rule, and the over snow vehicle use piece, the subpart C piece, was not mandatory. It was up to the Forest Service's discretion, and we flagged that. We were like, hey, no. Like the Executive Order says that over snow vehicles are off-road vehicles too, therefore this all needs to be mandatory. You can't pick and choose what types of travel management planning you do. But the Forest Service went forward with issuing that 2005 rule, including the subpart C, the over snow vehicle piece, as being discretionary. At which point we continued working our way through the administrative process. Thank you for the water. We continued working our way through the administrative process, which includes a number of steps and kind of didn't get anywhere. We also filed an administrative petition to the Department of Agriculture. So this is something that anybody can do where if there's some sort of rulemaking process you want the agency to embark on or change, you can submit a petition to the government saying, like, please do this thing. And so we submitted a petition in 2010 to remove that OSV exemption and make the subpart C winter travel planning mandatory rather than discretionary. And 90 other recreation and conservation organizations signed on to that petition. So again, it wasn't just Winter Wildlands Alliance. We were just sort of the organization that was out in front. But this was something that many organizations were interested in and many people across the country were interested in. As with most administrative petitions, that did not go anywhere. There are a lot of petitions that are filed to the government and most of them don't go anywhere. So we were like, what's the next step? Like, we still feel this is very important. What can we do? Sort of the final step in the process of participating in anything the federal government does is litigation. And that's something that my organization embarks on very cautiously and only as a last resort. And in this case, we felt it was an important enough issue to sort of the very core of our organization that it was worth going that route. So in 2011, we did file litigation suing the Forest Service and saying, hey, this 2005 travel management rule says that the over snow vehicle piece is discretionary. we believe that based on the executive order that the rule is written to address, that over snow vehicle use should be mandatory because President Nixon back in 1972 included vehicles that travel over snow and ice in his description of what an off-road vehicle is. And the federal court agreed with us. So in 2013, the court decided or issued a ruling saying that the discretionary subpart C violated the mandatory executive order requirement to designate a system of areas and trails for off-road vehicle use, including the over snow vehicle component. And the court told the Forest Service that they needed to issue a revised travel management rule, which brings us up to the present day. So in 2015, the Forest Service did publish a new travel management rule. Subparts A and B did not change, so nothing different there. And most of Subpart C actually stayed the same. They just changed it from up to the Forest Service's discretion to you have to do this. And that rulemaking process that led to that 2015 rule, and I know you can't read this, but this is the Federal Register. That's the rule itself. The rulemaking process that led up to that, just like the 2005 rulemaking process, was one that many different people participated in. Over 1,000 people commented on the draft revised rule and worked to kind of finesse it. And finally, the Forest Service came out with their final travel management rule in 2015, at which point every national forest in the country that receives sufficient snow to support winter recreation has to designate and display on an over snow vehicle use map, which is kind of like the motor vehicle use map, but the winter version, has to designate and display what routes and areas are open for over snow vehicle use. So prior to this new regulation, there wasn't really a systematic way in which over snow vehicles, which is not just snowmobiles and timber sleds, but snowcats, anything that, and the rule includes a definition, and it's like any sort of vehicle that is equipped with a track to travel over snow. It's kind of, makes sense if you go outside in the winter at all, what an over snow vehicle is. But up until this rule being issued, there was no set way in which the Forest Service needed to manage these vehicles. It was just each forest sort of had a different way of doing things, and the default across the country was that things are generally open to snowmobile over snow vehicle use unless they've specifically been designated closed. And those, there's many examples of how that may be. So it could be, a local Nordic ski trail system. The Forest Service may have issued a special order saying, these trails are closed to motor vehicle use. Or the forest plan may have said, this area that has, crucial winter range for elk is not open to motor vehicle use in the winter. There's a variety of ways in which the Forest Service does this, but there was no standardized way, and there still isn't because we're just in the very beginnings of this process. But under the new rule, once a forest goes through winter travel planning, they are going to designate where snowmobile use is allowed, and outside of where that's allowed, it's prohibited. And so it sort of flips the way that snowmobile use over snow vehicle use is managed from you can go wherever as long as it hasn't been specifically closed to you can go to the places that have specifically been opened, which may not actually look any different in a lot of places, but it's just sort of the other side of the coin. So that is the rule itself. Not every national forest in the country gets snow or gets enough snow to be considered, a forest that supports winter recreation. But of those that do, sort of in the snow belt, as of 2017, and this has changed, but not in any major way since then, the vast majority of national forests and grassland land in the country is currently open to over snow vehicles. Not because it's been designated for that use, not because it necessarily supports that use. The terrain may not be amenable, the vegetation may not be amenable, it may not actually get enough snow, but the forest overall does. This is sort of the current, footprint of what is open to snowmobiles and over snow vehicles, how much of those national forest lands are wilderness, and what percentage of those national forest lands are not open to motorized use in the winter and are also not wilderness, just to sort of break it out like that. And this data, when I first started at Winter Wildlands Alliance, one of the very first things I did was reach out to every national forest in the country that gets snow and ask them how they manage winter recreation use. And then I spent a year going through all of that data and trying to understand what the current footprint is. And then I've sort of updated it over the years as things have changed. So, right now, there are just a handful of national forests in the country that are going through this winter travel planning process. The vast majority of them are in California. So that's sort of the epicenter of winter travel planning and where this rule is really being tested out to understand what it means and how you do it and what it all looks like. There's also a national forest in Wyoming that is going through this, and a piece of a national forest, the northern portion of a ranger district on the Sawtooth in Idaho, and a very, very small piece of a ranger district in Montana. But primarily California and then also Wyoming. And so, all the other green spots are all the other forests that get snow outside of Alaska, or at least all the western forests. There's also the Midwest and New England. But you can see the vast majority of forests are not currently going through this process, and most of them will need to do so. So we've got lots of winter travel planning ahead of us. And winter travel planning is just like any other Forest Service process in that it's a public process. And it's all about public participation. This is, the Forest Service has a regulation that they need to comply with as far as what they have to do, designate a system of routes and areas for over snow vehicle use and do that in a way that meets those minimization criteria. So make sure that you're considering how it affects natural resources, wildlife, and other recreational uses. But each forest does this a little bit differently. But at the core, there's public participation is super important because the Forest Service they work for the public. And in most places, because over snow vehicle use it's kind of been a scattershot, the management of it at least has been a scattershot approach of like, we're going to close this trail or we're going to close this winter range, or maybe we haven't made any decisions and only the wilderness is closed. Like, this is really the first opportunity that communities have to come together and really think about how they want to see snowmobiles managed on their public lands, and think about what the future might bring. So with climate change, it may be that there are winter trailheads that don't get snow anymore. This is a big issue in California, and maybe it doesn't make any sense to have those be winter trailheads anymore. Maybe the trailhead needs to move uphill to where you can actually access the snow, or maybe the communities are growing super fast. So like where I live, and I think here as well, there are a ton of people moving in and more people in the backcountry, and there may be conflicts that weren't there in the past just because there's more people trying to do their thing on a limited amount of land. And this travel planning, it goes through the NEPA process, the National Environmental Policy Act process, which is basically the Forest Service puts out a proposed action, they accept public comment on it. They take that public comment, they develop a variety of alternatives of how they might do this, what this plan might look like. They put out a draft, range of alternatives, a draft environmental, analysis. The public looks at that. The public comments on that. The Forest Service takes those public comments, tweaks their plan some more, figures out what exactly in their mind, the perfect plan will be, which, if the Forest Service ever comes up with a plan that everybody thinks is perfect, then that will be the day. But they're working to balance a lot of different issues in any sort of planning process that they do, including in travel planning. But eventually they come out with a final plan, and at that point they will publish an over snow vehicle use map. This is an example of one from the Bitterroot National Forest in Montana. As you can see, not super helpful for navigational purposes, but it's really a legal enforcement document. So it's not intended necessarily for navigational purposes, but what it is it shows the areas, and if there's a designated trail, it shows what's open, and if it's not open, it's not open. And so the Forest Service can then use this to say, hey, you need to be in these areas. And right now, the Forest Service, sort of nationally at the DC level, is still refining their template for what these maps will look like. And so they're not totally standardized yet, but they're working on it. And then once they do refine that or come out with that template, then there will be a standardized map. And this is sort of the last step in travel planning. So once a forest publishes their over-snow vehicle use map, they're done with winter travel planning. Of course, just like any plan, it's not set in stone. It can always be revised over time as conditions change. There's also a component to the over-snow vehicle rule that allows for certain decisions to be grandfathered into these maps. And so, of course, most forests have some sort of snowmobile designation. Some have a lot, some have none. And some of those decisions, winter travel planning doesn't mean starting from scratch. It means starting from where you're at and figuring out how that fits into the rules and the regulations, and if it fits into the community's vision for what they want to see. And so some of those decisions, if they comply with the over-snow vehicle rule, so if they were done through a public process, if they consider the minimization criteria and meet the minimization criteria, so the public process and in the public record, it has to be documented that, yes, in making this decision, we looked at how it would impact wildlife, and we made sure to minimize impacts to wildlife through X, Y, and Z, or we considered how this designation would impact other types of recreation, and we made sure to minimize those conflicts through whatever. But if that has all been done and documented, there's no need to redo that decision. It can just be rolled into the over-snow vehicle use map. In some forests, especially those that already did this travel planning when it wasn't required, so a lot of forests in Montana actually have already done this, so they don't need to do it again. They just need to document that they did it, and then they can publish one of these maps once that template comes out. Other forests may be able to roll over a piece of their forest or certain decisions, and then do travel planning for the rest of the forest for the parts that weren't addressed in that decision, or maybe they need to tweak those decisions. But in no means does this planning process involve starting from scratch and pretending that there was never any snowmobile use on the forest. And here locally, the Grand Mesa, Uncompahgre, and Gunnison National Forests are going through forest planning. So forest planning is, as I'm sure many of you know, it's this sort of big picture planning document, like 30,000-foot view of how the national forest is going to be managed for the next generation. And that is different than winter travel planning. So winter travel planning is very site-specific. It's not something that's addressed in forest planning. The Forest Service is not going to be making specific area and trail designations in their forest plan process, but they will make decisions that set the stage for this winter travel planning. So in forest planning, the Forest Service looks at suitability for different uses, and that's suitability for timber, suitability for grazing, suitability for motorized use, suitability for all of the things that happen on the forest. And they sort of zone the forest into these uses are suitable in these areas, these uses are suitable in those areas. And then when you do travel planning, you're just going to be looking at, working on designating over-snow vehicle use in the places that are suitable for motorized use in the forest plan. So they kind of stack on top of each other in that way. And so, I think it's really great that Western is doing this speaker series now and getting people thinking about how this planning all fits together and getting the wheels turning, because none of these are quick processes. They all, forest planning takes a while, travel planning takes a while, and they're all better. They have a better outcome, and they're more enjoyable to go through for everybody when people are working together and finding common ground. And then also recognizing that we do all have different values and different opinions on how the forest should be managed, but hopefully can find some agreement around what's going to work for everybody. And then just sort of, as I mentioned, when I started at Winter Wildlands Alliance, I got all this data from every forest on how they, what the current situation is. And so for this forest, The yellow is all the places on the forest that are currently open to oversnow vehicles. That doesn't mean that all those places have snow. It doesn't mean all those places are places you could actually ride. It doesn't mean that all these places are necessarily appropriate for oversnow use. This is just the current situation. And it's kind of hard to tell between the two greens, but there's a lot of wilderness, which is not open to motor vehicles. And then there's a few places that are closed to oversnow vehicles, although they are also not wilderness. And then, of course, there's a couple ski areas as well, which each one's a little unique. So that's, this is kind of the current lay of the land, under the current forest plan, which will change, and then, before travel planning as well. So, yeah, I'm happy to answer questions. I can do it now or later, whatever works.
I think what we'd like to do is, if anybody's got a really pressing question right now, let's have a couple of questions. But there'll be, when our other speakers finish, we're going to open it up to more questions. But does anybody have anything you'd really like to bring up right now? Don't be shy.
Well, you did a really nice job explaining it. Thank you.
Great, thank you.